Let me take you back in time, to a place where stone walls echoed with the clatter of pans, and the scent of roasting meat drifted through grand hallways. Deep within the belly of a noble castle, far from the chambers of lords and ladies, there worked a man whose hands were always warm, whose apron was always stained, and whose day began long before the sun peeked over the hills. He was the castle's cook. The kitchen, though hidden below the stairs and past the servants' quarters, was the beating heart of the entire household. It was a world of its own, noisy, steamy, and alive, where fires burned from dusk to dawn and dozens of hands worked in rhythm like parts of a well-oiled machine. But before the commotion began, it all started with silence and firewood. In the cold hours before dawn, the cook rose from his straw-stuffed mattress. His bones ached. They always did. But his mind was already racing through the day's menu. He lit a tallow candle and slipped on a coarse tunic. As he walked through the quiet corridors, the castle still slept, except for the stable hands and the watchmen on the towers. But down in the kitchens, it was his domain. The first task: fire. He crouched before the great hearth and carefully coaxed last night's embers back to life, feeding them with dry straw and seasoned wood. The fire crackled awake like an old friend, warm and familiar. Beside it, the iron cauldron stood ready, blackened by years of cooking. The kitchen slowly filled with flickering light and the scent of smoke. Soon the other workers joined: the scullions, the spit boys, the pastry maid, the pot washer, and the butcher's apprentice. Each had their place, their rhythm, their routine. The cook didn't shout. He didn't need to. They all knew what had to be done. The morning meal was simple: porridge made from barley or oats, maybe with a bit of honey if the stores allowed it. Bread was sliced, dark, dense, and still warm from yesterday's baking. And there were eggs, if the hens had been generous. But preparing food for the castle was more than just making porridge. There were feasts to plan and dignitaries to impress. If a noble guest was expected, the entire kitchen would hum with urgency. Fresh meat had to be roasted, sauces had to be spiced just right, and pies had to look as fine as they tasted. The cook walked among his people, tasting this, smelling that, checking the dough, watching the stew bubble just enough. His nose was sharper than any hound, and his tongue could detect the slightest pinch of too much salt. He reached for a jar of imported spices: cinnamon from the east, cloves and peppercorns, precious treasures stored under lock and key. Only he had the key. He measured them carefully, grinding them in a stone mortar, breathing in their exotic scent. For a moment he let the aroma carry him far away beyond the castle to lands he'd never see. Outside the kitchen, a different world bustled. Pages ran up and down corridors with messages. Nobles lounged in heated chambers. Servants polished armor, but none of that mattered here. In the kitchen, time moved by the whistle of boiling broth and the turning of the spit. Speaking of spits, a whole piglet was roasting for the evening meal. A young boy, no older than 10, turned the heavy handle hour after hour. His cheeks were red from heat and his arms trembled, but he knew better than to complain. The cook had started just like him once, watching, learning, enduring. The cook passed him a crust of bread and the boy smiled. That was enough. For now. Back at the tables, pastry was being rolled, not sweet but savory, filled with minced meat, herbs, onions, and sometimes dried fruit. The pastry maid sang softly as she worked, the same melody every day, a tune she claimed her mother sang while cooking in another lord's home far away. By midday, the kitchen was loud and full of smells: garlic, herbs, boiling meat, stewed beans. The air shimmered with heat. Sweat dripped from brows. The cook wiped his hands on his apron and took a deep breath. Lunch was sent upstairs on large wooden platters, carried by careful hands through the winding staircases. Stews, breads, salted fish, and thick soups made their way to the noble family, while the kitchen workers shared what remained. It wasn't glamorous, but it filled the belly. The afternoon brought a brief lull. The fires quieted to embers, the pots soaked in cold water. The cook leaned back on a stool, his legs sore. He drank from a wooden cup, thin ale, weak but refreshing. Through the tiny window above, sunlight poured in, catching the flour in the air like golden dust. But rest never lasted long. By mid-afternoon, it was time to prepare the grand meal of the day, dinner. If a feast was planned, the menu became a performance. Dishes weren't just food, they were spectacle. Swans redressed in their feathers, meat pies shaped like castles, custards molded into flowers. He remembered once the Lord had asked for a dish he had only heard of. A peacock, roasted and served with its tail fanned out, covered in gold leaf. It took 3 days to prepare, and though the cook didn't get to taste it, he took pride in the gasps it earned when it was unveiled. Tonight's meal wasn't quite so grand, but still important. Roasted venison, apple tarts, a pottage of peas and herbs, and bread, always bread, made in round loaves, hard on the outside but warm and soft inside. As the sun dipped below the hills, torches were lit in the kitchen. Shadows danced on the walls. The hearth glowed bright, and the final dishes were placed on silver and pewter. The cook stood for a moment watching his team. The sweat, the soot, the quiet satisfaction. Dinner was served. Upstairs, laughter and music began to echo through the castle hall. Downstairs, the kitchen slowly emptied. Dirty plates returned, sometimes half-eaten, sometimes picked clean. The cook examined them. The venison had gone quickly, the pottage less so. He made a mental note to use fewer leeks next time. Cleaning began, scrubbing pots, wiping tables, dousing the embers. The scullions moved like shadows, quiet and tired. The cook stepped outside for a moment into the cool night air. The stars were out. The castle loomed above him, tall and proud. He stretched his arms, aching but content. His work was never praised, not by lords or ladies. He wasn't given medals or lands. But every meal that warmed a stomach, every smile at the table, that was enough. He returned inside, hung up his apron, and nodded goodnight to the boy at the spit, now asleep in the corner. Tomorrow would be the same, and he wouldn't have it any other way. Later that night, when the grand hall had quieted and the guests had returned to their chambers, the cook remained awake, sitting by the hearth with a bowl of cooled stew in his lap. The glow of the coals painted his face in shades of amber and ash. Around him, the kitchen lay still. The scullions had gone to their mats. The fire had dulled to a whisper, and the tools of the day were cleaned and hung in their proper places. This was his moment of peace. He stirred the stew slowly, not from hunger, but out of habit. His fingers, strong and calloused, had been burned, cut, and stained by years of work. Yet they moved with grace, the same grace a knight might use in battle, or a bard with his lute. He glanced to the corner of the kitchen where a wooden shelf held a collection of old recipes and notes, scribbled instructions passed down by previous cooks and a few of his own. Some were simple. Boil lentils till soft, add garlic and salt. Others more elaborate. Layer pike with rosemary and crushed hazelnut, roast till skin is crisp. Serve with wild plum sauce. He couldn't read every word, but he remembered the symbols, the smudges, the oil stains. They told a story in their own language. Sometimes, late at night like this, he thought of his past. He had not been born into a castle. His mother had sold bread in a village market. His father had been a tanner, always reeking of hides and lye. He'd become an apprentice cook at 12 in a manor house not half as grand as this. He'd learned to butcher, to boil, to bake, and most of all, to listen. To the meat, to the fire, to the silence before a pot boiled over. A loud crack snapped him from his thoughts. A log had split in the hearth. He chuckled quietly and stirred the embers with an iron poker. Sparks danced upward, swirling like fireflies caught in a sudden wind. Outside, he could hear the distant howl of a dog and the quiet clink of chainmail as the night guard passed by the gate. He knew that by first light it would all begin again. The carts would arrive with food from nearby farms, sacks of barley, wheels of cheese, bundles of leeks, crates of apples, sometimes even live hens in wooden cages. He would examine each delivery personally. One bad sack of grain could spoil a week's worth of bread. One spoiled fish could ruin a banquet. He took pride in this, in knowing what was fresh, what was too far gone, what needed curing, drying, salting. He was not just a cook. He was a manager, a guardian of supplies, a craftsman, and a silent observer of every detail within the castle. He knew who sneaked scraps from the table, which servants loved sweetmeats, and which knight always asked for extra onions. And there were rumors, of course. The kitchens always heard everything. Whispers about who was visiting whom after dark, about which noble had angered the lord, or who had arrived unexpectedly at the castle gate. Sometimes the cook knew what would happen in the castle even before the steward did. Not that he gossiped. He wasn't one to speak out of turn. But knowledge was like salt. Used wisely, it brought out the flavor of everything. He finished his stew and set the bowl aside. Then he walked to the rear pantry, a cool stone room where barrels were stacked high with salted fish, dried fruits, and ale. He checked the levels carefully, tapping on the casks, sniffing at the lids. He made a note, mental, not written, that they were running low on dried mint, and that the apples were starting to spoil. Back in the kitchen, the spit boy stirred from his sleep, rubbing his eyes. "Master, shall I bank the fire?" The cook nodded. "Yes, lad, but leave a few coals alive. We'll need them in the morning." The boy shuffled off to the hearth, carefully piling ash over the glowing logs, leaving just enough warmth to restart the flame at dawn. It was a lesson all young cooks learned. Never let the fire die. Just like in the kitchen, never let the rhythm stop. The cook stretched his back and looked toward the high ceiling beams. How many years had he worked beneath these dark timbers? 10? 15? Perhaps more. He'd lost count. But every groove in the wood above, every crack in the stone floor felt like part of his body now. Familiar, trusted, enduring. He moved to the window slit. A cold breeze slipped through, brushing his face. The moon hung high, silver and silent. Somewhere beyond the hills, another cook was likely just rising, starting the fire for the day ahead. The world turned, and so did the kitchens of the world. He turned back into the room, walked to his cot in the corner, and sat. He unlaced his worn leather shoes and placed them neatly beside his bedroll. Then, with a deep sigh, he laid back and closed his eyes. And just before sleep took him, he thought one last thought. But sleep didn't come easily that night. The wind howled louder than usual through the narrow stone corridors, rattling the shutters of the high windows. Somewhere far off, the faint echo of a lute being played carried down the halls, likely a drunken noble trying to charm one of the serving girls. The cook lay still, staring into the dark. His thoughts, however, were wide awake. He began to think about the feast planned for the next full moon, a celebration of the Lord's birthday. Already the steward had spoken of wild boar, stuffed goose, sweet pastries shaped like crowns, and candied almonds rolled in rosewater. A massive affair. The kind that drained every grain, every spice jar, every bit of patience. He pictured the kitchen, alive with noise and color. The butcher hacking at a boar leg. The pastry girl dusted in flour from head to toe. The fire roaring with 4 spits turning at once. The hall above lit with torches, musicians playing, guests shouting and laughing, goblets raised. But below was always different. Down in the kitchens, it wasn't about spectacle. It was about survival. About keeping the rhythm, the control, the timing. One overcooked roast could bring shame. One collapsed tart could spark a noble's insult. And nobles did love to mock the kitchen, even as they filled their greedy mouths. The cook rolled to his side. He thought of Matilda de Nudoitz, the old baker's daughter, who once worked the ovens. She used to bring him the first crust of each new loaf, still steaming, as a sort of offering. She had laughter in her voice even when her hands were burned. One winter she caught a fever and never came back. No one mentioned her again, but the cook remembered. Always. He remembered all who had passed through the kitchen. The boy who cut himself and cried. The old assistant who taught him how to keep dough from cracking in the cold months. The mute girl who carved vegetables into flowers for noble feasts, using only a blunt knife and her quiet genius. They were all part of the story. The castle forgot them. The kitchen did not. He finally drifted into sleep, but it was not a dreamless one. He saw himself standing by a giant oven, but the flames danced in strange colors. Blue, green, purple. The room was silent, but he could hear the crackling of 1,000 loaves baking at once. Then came a voice, unfamiliar, ancient, whispering, "Let no fire die, let no bread fail." He awoke before dawn, heart steady. It was still dark, but the instinct was stronger than sleep. His hand reached out, already searching for flint and tinder. The day was ready to begin again. Down in the storeroom, he lit a lantern and inspected the baskets. A surprise delivery had arrived during the night. Fresh trout, still glistening, wrapped in wet cloth. A gift from the river steward. He smiled to himself. This could be turned into something fine. Maybe a pie with herbs. Maybe served cold with vinegar and lemon balm. He'd decide later. A knock echoed through the kitchen door. The miller's boy, red-faced and panting. "Master cook, flour." The storm came early. "We brought what we could, but the rest is wet." The cook nodded solemnly, accepted the sacks, and gave the boy a crust of yesterday's bread. Then he turned to his assistant and whispered, "We'll need to dry the good flour by the fire. Use cloth. Slow, not hot, or it'll clump." Obstacles. Always obstacles. But nothing new. The kitchen adapted. The kitchen survived. By sunrise, the fires were blazing again. A pot of bean stew was already bubbling, and the scent of garlic filled the room. The scullions returned, still yawning, rubbing their eyes. The cook handed out tasks like a conductor raising his baton. Smooth, precise. He noticed a young maid staring longingly at the roast chicken cooling on a shelf. "You hungry, girl?" he asked. She blushed. "Aye, master. My shift began at the laundry. I missed my meal." Without a word, he tore a leg from the roast, wrapped it in a cloth, and placed it in her hands. "Eat it behind the spice rack. No crumbs on the floor." She smiled. "Thank you, sir." He nodded. He wasn't unkind, just busy. Later that morning, he oversaw the preparation of almond milk, a delicacy for the Lord's wife, who claimed cow's milk upset her stomach. Crushed almonds were soaked, strained, and sweetened with honey. A slow, careful task. One slip and the texture turned grainy. But the cook had done it 100 times. He handed the jug to the chamber servant with a quiet warning. "Serve it warm, not hot." And so the day spun on. By mid-morning, a problem arrived in the form of the steward's scowl. "His lordship has changed his mind," the steward said flatly. "He wants roast quail tonight, stuffed with chestnuts. He's heard the Bishop of Lincoln had it served last week." The cook did not flinch. He only replied, "We've no fresh quail." "Then find them," came the answer, sharp as steel. The cook turned to one of the kitchen boys. "Go to the falconer's man. Ask if the foresters have caught any. Offer dried apples in trade." The boy ran. It was always like this, adapting, improvising, balancing pride and duty. He sometimes felt like a juggler in a hall full of blind men. No one saw the effort, only the result. But he didn't need praise. The sizzling pan, the bubbling broth, the hush when a feast began. These were his rewards. And at the very end of the day, when the hall was swept and the torches died out, the cook would return to his little shelf of notes. He'd sit down, open the oldest, most stained page, and add a few words of his own. Quail. 10 minutes over high flame, then wrap in damp cloth, bake slow with herbs. He smiled. Another secret passed on. Another piece of knowledge saved. Another day lived well, in fire and flavor and silence. As the last echoes of the feast faded from the upper halls and the moon cast its pale glow over the stone towers, the cook lingered once more by the dying hearth. A few glowing embers still breathed softly, pulsing like a heartbeat in the ash. Around him, the kitchen had settled into silence. Only the faint creak of wood and the distant hoot of an owl reminded him that the world outside was still turning. He stood alone now, hands folded behind his back, gazing at the soot-darkened walls. Every burn mark on the hearth, every groove in the table, every notch in the chopping block, they were memories. Each one told a quiet story. There was the corner where a young helper once spilled hot broth and cried, and the cook, instead of scolding, had handed him a new ladle and simply said, "Again." There was the iron pot, cracked at the rim, still in use after all these years. Not perfect, but dependable. He reached up to a high beam above the oven where he kept something no one else knew about, a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside it were a few old things. A wooden spoon carved by his first master, now blackened and worn smooth from decades of use. A dried sprig of lavender from a long-ago summer when the castle garden had overflowed with scent. And a tiny scrap of parchment with his mother's name, faded by time, nearly unreadable. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Maybe rain, maybe guests, maybe broken pots or soured milk. But he would face it all the same way he always had, with quiet discipline, with care, with fire in his hands and patience in his bones. And when he was gone, long after his last meal had been served and his name forgotten by the lords above, the kitchen would remember. The rhythms would go on. New hands would stir the pot, new voices would echo against the stone, but something of him, some taste, some habit, some tiny whisper of wisdom, would remain in the heat of the hearth and the scent of the bread. That was his legacy, not carved in stone, not sung in songs, but simmering gently, forever, in the soul of the kitchen. And if you've enjoyed this quiet walk through the kitchens of a medieval castle, if the sounds, the scents, and the stories stirred something in you, then I invite you to stay with us a little longer. There are many more tales to share, of forgotten lives, hidden halls, and simple souls who shaped great histories. So if you'd like to hear more stories like this one, don't forget to like this video and follow the channel. It helps keep the fire burning and ensures you never miss the next tale from the Middle Ages. Until next time, sleep well, and may your bread always rise.